Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in recorded Missouri history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach people around the world. In the autumn of 1893, deep within the Ozark wilderness of southern Missouri, two experienced trappers embarked on what should have been a routine expedition. What they discovered in those dense woodlands would challenge every assumption about human nature and the lengths to which desperation can drive a person. This is not a tale of supernatural occurrences or unexplained phenomena, but rather a methodical examination of documented evidence that reveals something far more unsettling: the capacity for ordinary people to cross lines that should never be crossed. The Missouri State Archives contain a collection of documents from the Crawford County Sheriff's Office dating to the winter of 1893. Among these yellowed papers, filed under Unresolved Investigations, lies the case file of Ezekiel Thornfield and Matthias Crane. Both men were seasoned trappers, well known throughout the region for their expertise in navigating the treacherous terrain of what would later become the Mark Twain National Forest. These were men accustomed to spending months in isolation, living off the land and the pelts they could gather during the lucrative winter trapping season. Thornfield, at 34 years of age, had been working these woods since he was barely 18. Born in the small settlement of Cuba, Missouri, he had learned the trapper's trade from his father, who had himself spent decades working the waterways and ridges of the Ozark Mountains. Neighbors described Thornfield as a methodical man, someone who approached his work with the careful planning of a military campaign. He maintained detailed maps of trap lines, recorded weather patterns and animal behavior, and had developed a reputation for returning from expeditions with consistently profitable loads of pelts. Matthias Crane presented a different personality entirely. Older than his partner at 39, Crane had come to Missouri from Pennsylvania in 1885, following reports of abundant fur-bearing animals in the Ozark region. Unlike Thornfield, who had inherited both his profession and his territory, Crane was an innovator, constantly seeking new techniques and unexplored areas that might yield superior results. Local trappers respected his expertise, but found him somewhat unpredictable, prone to abandoning proven methods in favor of experimental approaches that sometimes led to spectacular successes and occasionally to complete failures. The partnership between Thornfield and Crane had developed over 3 seasons of working adjacent trap lines. Initially competitors, they had discovered that their different approaches to the trade complemented each other effectively. Thornfield's methodical planning provided stability and consistent results, while Crane's willingness to explore new territories and techniques opened opportunities that neither man could have achieved independently. By the autumn of 1893, they had established a routine of working together during the most productive months of the trapping season, combining their catches and sharing both the risks and the profits of extended expeditions into the remote areas of the Ozark wilderness. The initial police report, dated November 15, 1893, states that the men had been missing for approximately 3 weeks. Their families had grown concerned when neither man returned to their respective homes in Cuba, Missouri, by their agreed-upon date of October 25th. Both men were married and had established clear patterns regarding their expeditions. Thornfield's wife, Cordelia, told investigators that her husband had never been late returning from a trapping expedition by more than 2 days, and that he always sent word ahead if weather or other circumstances were likely to delay his return. Crane's wife, Beatrice, provided a similar account to the authorities. She described her husband as someone who planned his expeditions with military precision, calculating provisions, timing, and expected yields weeks in advance. According to her testimony, Crane had been particularly excited about this expedition, believing that he and Thornfield had identified an area of the forest that had remained largely unexplored by other trappers. He had told her that they expected to return with the most profitable load of pelts either man had ever secured. The families had initially assumed that early winter weather might have delayed the men's return. The autumn of 1893 had brought several severe storms to the Ozark region, with heavy snows falling earlier than usual. However, as the days passed without any word from the trappers, and as other men working the same general area returned to their homes on schedule, concern turned to alarm. By early November, both families were pressing local authorities to organize a search expedition. The search party that eventually located their camp was led by Deputy Sheriff Augustus Vail, a man who had spent most of his 38 years in the Crawford County backcountry and was widely regarded as one of the most skilled woodsmen in the region. Vail assembled a team of 8 experienced hunters and trackers, men familiar with the specific area where Thornfield and Crane had planned to work. The search party departed Cuba on November 10, 1893, carrying provisions for a week-long expedition and equipped with the best available maps of the region. According to Deputy Vail's official report, the search team spent 2 days working their way through the maze of ridges and valleys that characterized the Thornfield-Crane expedition area. The terrain was challenging even for experienced woodsmen, with dense undergrowth, steep ravines, and numerous creek crossings that could become impassable during periods of heavy rain. The searchers found several old campsites that showed evidence of recent use, but none that could be definitively linked to the missing trappers. On the morning of November 12th, the search party discovered what appeared to be a regularly maintained trail leading deeper into the wilderness than any of the searchers had previously explored. The trail showed clear signs of recent use, with broken branches and disturbed ground indicating that people had been moving along this route within the past few weeks. Following this trail for approximately 3 miles, the search party arrived at a natural clearing in a hollow that local hunters referred to as Devil's Kettle. The clearing itself was unremarkable, a roughly circular open space perhaps 50 yards across, surrounded by dense stands of oak and hickory trees. What made it notable was the presence of an obviously well-established camp, complete with a carefully constructed lean-to shelter, an elaborate fire pit surrounded by seating made from arranged logs, and various pieces of equipment that clearly indicated long-term occupation. Most significant was the fire pit itself, which contained not cold ashes, but glowing embers that suggested someone had been tending the fire very recently. Deputy Vail's report describes approaching the camp with considerable caution, calling out repeatedly to announce the search party's presence, and to request that any occupants identify themselves. When no response came, the searchers moved closer to examine the camp more thoroughly. What they found defied easy explanation and would form the foundation for one of the most puzzling missing person cases in Missouri history. The camp was meticulously organized, displaying the kind of attention to detail that experienced trappers developed over years of wilderness living. The lean-to shelter was constructed with obvious skill, using locally available materials but assembled with techniques that demonstrated considerable expertise. The structure was weatherproof, well ventilated, and spacious enough to accommodate 2 people comfortably. Inside the shelter, the searchers found 2 bedrolls arranged on platforms of woven branches that kept them off the ground and provided insulation from the cold earth. Personal belongings were organized with military precision. 2 rifle cases leaned against the back wall of the shelter, each containing a well-maintained weapon and an adequate supply of ammunition. Clothing was folded and stored in canvas bags that protected it from moisture. Cooking equipment was cleaned and arranged near the fire pit, with provisions stored in sealed containers designed to prevent spoilage and to discourage raids by forest animals. Most significantly, the searchers discovered a collection of pelts that represented weeks of successful trapping. The furs were properly cleaned and stretched, indicating that whoever had been working this area possessed the skills necessary to preserve their catch for eventual sale. The quantity and quality of the pelts suggested that the camp's occupants had been extraordinarily successful in their trapping efforts, far exceeding what most trappers could expect to accomplish during a similar period. Deputy Vale noted in his report that everything about the camp suggested normal, successful trapping operations. The equipment was well maintained, the provisions were adequate, and the accumulated pelts represented significant monetary value. Nothing indicated struggle, hasty departure, or any kind of emergency that might explain why the camp's occupants would abandon their valuable possessions and disappear into the wilderness. The mystery deepened when the search party discovered that the camp contained personal items that definitely belonged to Thornfield and Crane. Cordelia Thornfield identified her husband's distinctive hunting jacket, a garment she had modified with additional pockets specifically for carrying trapping supplies. Beatrice Crane recognized her husband's pipe and tobacco pouch, items he carried on every expedition and would never have left behind voluntarily. Among the abandoned possessions, the searchers found a leather-bound journal that belonged to Ezekiel Thornfield. The journal contained entries dating from the beginning of the expedition on September 30th through the final entry dated November 8th, just 4 days before the search party discovered the abandoned camp. These entries would provide the most detailed information available about the trappers' final weeks and would reveal a progression of events that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of their experience in the wilderness. The early entries in Thornfield's journal paint a picture of a highly successful expedition. His first few weeks of writing describe excellent hunting conditions, favorable weather, and the kind of productive partnership that both men had hoped to achieve. Thornfield writes enthusiastically about their decision to explore territory that neither man had worked before, following reports from other trappers about abundant beaver populations in the remote valleys beyond the established hunting grounds. September 30th entry reads, "Weather clear and cold, perfect for the season." Matthias suggests we push further east than either of us has been before. The old-timers in town spoke of beaver dams in the headwaters of Little Piney Creek that have never been properly worked. If we can locate these sites, this could be our most profitable season yet. October 3rd. Found what we were looking for. Matthias was right about the beaver population. Discovered 3 separate dam complexes within 2 miles of our camp. Animals appear to be undisturbed by human activity, likely because few trappers venture this deep into the hills. Set our first trap line today. If the rest of the territory proves equally productive, we will return home with more pelts than we can carry. The entries from early October describe the establishment of their routine and the gradual expansion of their trapping operations. Thornfield notes that Crane had developed an innovative approach to trap placement that took advantage of the natural geography of the area to funnel animals into positions where they could be captured efficiently. The technique required more initial labor than traditional methods, but promised significantly higher yields over the course of their expedition. October 8th. Matthias has outdone himself with the trapline design. His understanding of how water flows through this valley system has allowed us to predict exactly where the animals will travel. We are catching twice what I would normally expect in territory this rich. At this rate, we will have enough pelts to justify staying an extra week beyond our original schedule. However, by mid-October, subtle changes begin to appear in Thornfield's writing. While the trapping continued to be successful, he begins to mention aspects of their situation that caused him some concern. The first hints of trouble appear in his entry for October 12th, where he notes that Crane had begun exploring areas of the forest that seemed to have no relevance to their trapping operations. October 12th. Matthias spent most of yesterday investigating what he claims are unusual rock formations about a mile north of our camp. I examined the area myself and can see nothing remarkable about it, but he insists there are signs of previous human activity. He has found what he believes are stone tools and evidence of old fire pits. I told him that Indian camps are not uncommon in these hills, but he seems convinced that what he has discovered is somehow different. The entries from this period reveal a growing tension between the two men's approaches to their expedition. While Thornfield remained focused on their stated objective of accumulating pelts, Crane was becoming increasingly distracted by what he characterized as archaeological discoveries. Thornfield's writing suggests frustration with his partner's divided attention and concern that these distractions might interfere with their trapping operations. October 15th. Found Matthias this morning examining what he claims are carved symbols on a boulder near the creek. Spent 2 hours looking at the rock myself and can see nothing but natural weathering patterns. When I suggested we focus on checking our trap lines, he became defensive and accused me of lacking intellectual curiosity. This is not like him. Matthias is normally as focused on practical matters as I am. By late October, Thornfield's journal entries reveal that Crane's behavior had become increasingly erratic. Rather than participating in their normal trapping routine, Crane was spending entire days exploring areas that seemed to have no connection to their work. More troubling, he was beginning to make claims about his discoveries that Thornfield found difficult to believe. October 18th. Matthias returned to camp today carrying what he insists are tools made by people who lived in these hills long before any Indian tribes we know about. The items appear to be nothing more than ordinary stones to me, but he is convinced they show evidence of sophisticated craftsmanship. He speaks of finding caves that contain evidence of human habitation, but he refuses to show me these locations, says I would not understand the significance of what he has discovered. The journal entries from the final week of October show Thornfield's growing alarm about his partner's mental state. Crane's preoccupation with his alleged archaeological discoveries had escalated to the point where he was neglecting basic camp maintenance and ignoring the trap lines entirely. More disturbing, he had begun making statements that suggested his grip on reality might be loosening. October 22nd. Matthias claims that the people who left the artifacts he has been finding were not ordinary human beings. He speaks of tools that show impossible precision, of cave paintings that depict events that could not have been witnessed by primitive people, of evidence that these ancient inhabitants possessed knowledge that modern science cannot explain. I fear that the isolation is affecting his mind. October 25th. This was the day we planned to begin our return journey, but Matthias refuses to leave. He says we cannot abandon what he has discovered, that the world must know about the evidence he has uncovered. When I reminded him of our responsibilities to our families, he became angry and accused me of being willing to sacrifice scientific discovery for mere profit. We are now 3 days past our planned departure date. The entries for late October reveal that the partnership between Thornfield and Crane had deteriorated completely. Crane's obsession with his discoveries had consumed all of his attention, while Thornfield found himself managing the camp alone and growing increasingly concerned about their ability to return home safely before severe winter weather made travel impossible. October 28th. Matthias has been absent from camp for 2 days. He left early yesterday morning, carrying his pack and promising to show me definitive proof of his claims when he returned. Found myself alone in camp, tending the fire and checking trap lines by myself. Weather is turning colder, and I fear we may be trapped here by snow if we do not leave soon. When Crane finally returned to camp, according to Thornfield's journal, his behavior had become even more disturbing. The journal entry for October 29th describes a man who appeared to have been profoundly affected by whatever he had discovered during his absence from their base camp. October 29th. Matthias returned at dawn carrying a canvas bundle that he guards jealously. He claims to have found a cave system that extends deep into the hills, with chambers that show evidence of habitation by people whose level of development exceeded anything we associate with the native tribes of this region. He speaks of finding preserved artifacts, cave paintings that depict astronomical events, and evidence of metallurgy that should not have existed in this part of the world. Thornfield's description of his partner's condition suggests that Crane had been severely shaken by his experience. The journal notes that Crane appeared exhausted, as though he had not slept during his 2-day absence, and that he seemed reluctant to provide specific details about what he had discovered. When pressed for more information, Crane would only say that some knowledge was too dangerous to share without proper preparation. October 30th. Attempted to convince Matthias that we must begin our journey home immediately. Weather reports from the south suggest that severe storms are moving into our area. If we do not leave within the next few days, we risk being trapped here until spring. Matthias agrees that departure is necessary, but he insists on making one final expedition to the cave system he has discovered. Says he must retrieve additional evidence before we can safely reveal what we have learned. The journal entries for early November show Thornfield's growing desperation as weather conditions continued to deteriorate and his partner's behavior became increasingly irrational. Crane had become secretive about his activities, leaving camp for extended periods without explanation and returning with additional artifacts that he refused to allow Thornfield to examine closely. November 2nd. Snow beginning to fall heavily, temperature dropping rapidly. Checked our route back to Cuba and found that several creek crossings are already becoming dangerous due to ice formation. If we do not leave within the next 2 days, we will be forced to remain here until weather conditions improve. Matthias seems unconcerned about our situation, claims that what he has discovered is worth any risk. See November 4th. Matthias revealed the contents of the bundle he has been guarding. The artifacts appear to be made from metals I do not recognize, worked with a precision that suggests tools far more sophisticated than anything I have ever seen. More disturbing are the cave paintings he has copied. The images depict events and creatures that I cannot identify, rendered with an artistic skill that seems impossible for primitive people. The journal entry for November 5th marks a turning point in Thornfield's account. Up to this point, despite his concerns about Crane's behavior, Thornfield had maintained his skepticism about his partner's claims. However, something that occurred on this date appears to have convinced him that Crane's discoveries were genuine and that they represented something far more significant than simple archaeological finds. November 5th. Matthias finally agreed to show me the cave system he has been exploring. What I saw there has shaken my understanding of this region's history and raised questions about the nature of the people who inhabited these hills before recorded settlement. The caves are extensive, with chambers that show clear evidence of long-term human habitation. The artifacts Matthias has collected represent only a tiny fraction of what remains in those underground rooms. Thornfield's description of the cave system suggests a complex of underground chambers that had been modified by human activity over an extended period. According to his account, the caves contained evidence of sophisticated engineering, with water management systems that controlled drainage and airflow, and living spaces that had been carefully designed to provide comfort and security for their inhabitants. November 6th. The cave paintings are unlike anything I have ever seen. The images depict not only animals and hunting scenes, but astronomical events, geographical features of the region rendered with map-like precision, and human figures engaged in activities that I cannot interpret. Most disturbing are the paintings that appear to show the caves themselves. with detailed representations of chambers that extend far deeper into the earth than Matthias and I have been able to explore. The journal entry for November 7th reveals that Thornfield's exploration of the cave system had convinced him that Crane's claims about the significance of their discovery were accurate. However, rather than sharing his partner's enthusiasm for revealing their find to the outside world, Thornfield had concluded that the knowledge they had gained posed dangers that neither man was equipped to handle. November 7th. After seeing the full extent of what Matthias has discovered, I understand why he has been so profoundly affected by this experience. The evidence suggests that these caves were inhabited by people whose level of technological development far exceeded what we associate with the prehistoric inhabitants of North America. The implications of this discovery would challenge fundamental assumptions about human history in this region. However, Thornfield's excitement about the archaeological significance of their discovery was tempered by practical concerns about their situation. The same entry continues with his assessment that they were facing a crisis that went beyond simple weather delays. November 7th continued, but I have also realized that we are no longer alone in this wilderness. During our exploration of the caves, Matthias and I found evidence that these underground chambers are currently being used by someone: fresh food stores, recently used fire pits, and sleeping areas that show signs of regular occupation. Someone is living in these caves, and they are aware of our presence in the region. The implications of this discovery appear to have convinced Thornfield that their situation had become genuinely dangerous. His journal entry for November 8th describes a conversation with Crane in which both men acknowledged that they had stumbled upon something that could not be safely ignored or simply walked away from. November 8th. Matthias and I have discussed our situation and reached a difficult conclusion. The people currently living in the cave system have been aware of our presence since the early days of our expedition. Evidence throughout the cave suggests that they have been systematically observing us, learning our routines, and possibly preparing for some form of contact. We cannot simply pack our equipment and return home as though nothing has happened. The final entry in Thornfield's journal reveals that both men had come to believe that their discovery of the cave system and its current inhabitants had placed them in an impossible position. They possessed knowledge that they believed could not be safely shared with authorities. Yet they also felt that they could not simply abandon the situation without risking consequences for future visitors to the region. November 8th, final entry. After extensive discussion, Matthias and I have agreed on a course of action. We cannot return to civilization with knowledge of what we have discovered here, but we also cannot ignore our responsibility to protect others who might venture into this area. Tomorrow we will take steps to ensure that the secrets of these caves remain protected, while also ensuring that the current inhabitants are not disturbed by future expeditions. Some knowledge is too dangerous for the outside world. The journal ends there, leaving investigators with more questions than answers about the ultimate fate of Thornfield and Crane. Deputy Vale's report notes that an extensive search of the area around their abandoned camp revealed several partially filled excavations, suggesting that the men had been engaged in some form of digging activity in the days before their disappearance. However, no evidence was found of what, if anything, they might have been attempting to bury or retrieve. Among the items catalogued from the abandoned camp was the canvas bundle mentioned in Thornfield's journal entries. According to the inventory list maintained by Deputy Vale, the bundle contained what appeared to be fragments of worked metal, pieces of carved stone, and several sheets of paper bearing copied images from cave paintings. These items were transported to the Crawford County Courthouse for examination, but the official records contain no detailed analysis of their significance or origin. The investigation took an unexpected direction when Deputy Vale decided to locate and explore the cave system described in Thornfield's journal. Using the rough map included among the trappers' possessions, a small team of experienced woodsmen was assembled to conduct a systematic exploration of the underground chambers. What they discovered would convince authorities that the case of the missing trappers was far more complex than a simple wilderness accident. Vale's private notes, discovered among his personal effects after his death in 1923, provide a detailed account of what the exploration team found within the caves. According to these records, the underground complex was far more extensive than Thornfield's journal had suggested, with chambers that extended deep into the hillside and showed clear evidence of modification by human activity over many years. The caves contained elaborate living spaces, with rooms that had been carved from the natural rock and furnished with carefully constructed furniture made from stone and wood. Water management systems channeled underground streams to provide fresh water throughout the complex, while ventilation shafts ensured adequate air circulation in even the deepest chambers. The level of engineering expertise demonstrated by these modifications far exceeded anything that investigating officers had expected to find in what they had assumed would be simple natural caves. More significant were the artifacts found throughout the underground complex. Vale's notes describe tools and implements that demonstrated a level of craftsmanship that seemed inconsistent with the primitive technology typically associated with prehistoric inhabitants of the region. Metallurgy was evident in numerous objects, with alloys and working techniques that appeared to be far more sophisticated than anything documented among Native American cultures of the historical period. The cave paintings described in Thornfield's journal were even more remarkable than his written account had suggested. Vale's team found chambers with walls covered in detailed images that depicted not only hunting and ceremonial scenes, but also astronomical observations, geographical surveys, and technical diagrams that appeared to represent engineering principles. The artistic quality and technical precision of these paintings suggested a level of cultural development that challenged conventional assumptions about the prehistoric inhabitants of the Missouri Ozarks. However, the most disturbing discovery made by Vale's exploration team was evidence that the caves were indeed currently inhabited. Throughout the complex, investigators found signs of recent human activity, including fresh food stores, regularly maintained fire pits, and sleeping areas that showed evidence of ongoing use. The current inhabitants had clearly been living in the caves for an extended period, with storage areas containing preserved food, manufactured goods, and personal belongings that indicated a well-established community. Vale's notes suggest that the cave dwellers had been aware of the investigation from its earliest stages. Throughout their exploration, team members reported the persistent sensation of being observed, with sounds and movements in unexplored sections of the complex that indicated the presence of people who were deliberately avoiding contact. On several occasions, the investigators found evidence that areas they had examined during previous visits had been altered, with objects moved and passages blocked in ways that suggested systematic efforts to conceal the full extent of the underground community. The exploration team's most significant discovery came in the deeper chambers of the cave system, where they found clear evidence of the activities that had apparently convinced Thornfield and Crane that their discovery posed dangers that could not be ignored. Vale's notes describe areas that appeared to have been used for purposes that the investigating officers found deeply disturbing, with implements and arrangements that suggested practices that fell far outside the boundaries of acceptable human behavior. Rather than provide specific details about these discoveries in his official reports, Vale made the decision to classify this information and to recommend that the cave system be permanently sealed to prevent further investigation or accidental discovery by future visitors to the region. His notes indicate that this decision was reached in consultation with other members of the exploration team, who unanimously agreed that the public interest would be better served by ensuring that the underground community remained isolated from the outside world. The sealing of the caves was accomplished using dynamite to collapse the main entrances, effectively trapping the current inhabitants within the underground complex while simultaneously preventing outside access to the chambers and their contents. Vale's note suggests that this action was taken reluctantly, with full awareness that it condemned unknown numbers of people to permanent underground imprisonment, but with the conviction that the alternative posed unacceptable risks to the surrounding communities. The official investigation into the disappearance of Thornfield and Crane was closed in the summer of 1894, with both men declared dead due to unknown causes. The case files contain no reference to the cave exploration or the decision to seal the underground complex, and subsequent inquiries about the missing trappers were directed to the standard conclusion that they had been victims of a wilderness accident. However, the story of the missing trappers and the sealed caves did not end with the official closure of the investigation. Over the years that followed, numerous incidents occurred in the region that suggested the consequences of the cave sealing had not been as final as authorities had hoped. Reports began to accumulate of unusual activities in the forests around Devil's Kettle, with hunters and loggers describing encounters with individuals who appeared to be living entirely off the land. These reports consistently described people who possessed wilderness skills that exceeded those of even the most experienced outdoorsmen. Witnesses spoke of individuals who could move through the forest without making sound, who seemed to possess intimate knowledge of animal behavior and seasonal changes, and who appeared to be surviving in conditions that would quickly prove fatal to ordinary people. Most disturbing were reports of systematic theft from hunting camps and logging operations in the region. Equipment and supplies were disappearing from secured locations, always taken by someone who could approach and remove items without leaving any detectable traces. The thefts were clearly the work of people rather than animals, but they were accomplished with a stealth that suggested abilities far beyond those of ordinary criminals. Local law enforcement investigated these incidents, but their efforts were hampered by the complete absence of evidence that could be used to identify or track the perpetrators. Footprints were never found. Witnesses were never able to provide detailed descriptions of suspects, and the stolen items disappeared completely without any evidence of where they might have been taken. The pattern of thefts and mysterious encounters continued for several years, gradually creating an atmosphere of unease among people who worked or traveled in the remote areas of Crawford County. By the early 1900s, many experienced hunters and trappers had begun avoiding the region around Devil's Kettle entirely, effectively creating an unofficial wilderness preserve where few outsiders ventured. The most detailed account of contact with the mysterious forest dwellers comes from a hunting party that entered the region in October of 1902. According to a report filed with the Missouri State Game Commission, this party encountered clear evidence of human activity throughout their expedition, despite never actually seeing another person during their 5-day stay in the wilderness. The hunting party, led by an experienced guide named Isaiah Montgomery, had planned a routine deer hunting expedition in an area that had previously been considered safe and productive. However, from their first day in the field, they began noticing signs that suggested they were not alone in the forest. Equipment that was carefully secured each night would be found in slightly different positions the following morning, with no indication of how these changes had occurred. More unsettling was the party's growing realization that they were being systematically observed throughout their stay. Game that they successfully tracked during the day would disappear overnight, apparently taken by someone who could approach and remove the animals without leaving any tracks that the experienced hunters could follow. On multiple occasions, party members reported the sensation of being watched from the surrounding forest, but extensive searches never revealed any sign of human presence. The hunting party's experience reached its climax on their 4th night in the wilderness, when they were awakened by sounds that suggested someone was moving around their camp. Looking outside their tents, several party members reported seeing shadowy figures at the edge of their firelight, apparently observing them from the darkness. When they called out, the figures retreated immediately, moving through the underbrush with a silence that seemed impossible for human beings. The following morning, the hunting party discovered that their experience during the night had not been a shared hallucination. Someone had indeed visited their camp while they slept, leaving behind clear evidence of their presence. A message had been carved into the bark of a tree near their fire pit, consisting of symbols that none of the party members could interpret, but that clearly represented some form of deliberate communication. More disturbing was the hunting party's discovery that their food supplies had been systematically examined during the night visit. Containers had been opened and their contents apparently tested or sampled, then carefully resealed and returned to their original positions. The precision with which this had been accomplished suggested that whoever had conducted this examination possessed both considerable skill and detailed knowledge of how such supplies were typically packed and stored. The hunting party made the decision to cut their expedition short and return immediately to Cuba. Their report to the State Game Commission recommended that the region around Devil's Kettle be officially designated as off-limits to recreational hunting, arguing that the area appeared to be occupied by individuals whose relationship to the civilized world had been severed so completely that contact between the two groups could only result in tragedy. This recommendation was never officially implemented, but word of the hunting party's experience spread rapidly throughout the regional outdoor community. By 1905, few licensed hunters or trappers were willing to venture into the deeper sections of the forest around Devil's Kettle, effectively creating an unofficial exclusion zone that remained largely uninhabited by anyone from the outside world. The unofficial status of this exclusion zone was formalized in 1908, when the state of Missouri designated a large section of the Crawford County wilderness as a protected natural area. The official justification for this designation cited the need to preserve unique geological features and protect sensitive wildlife habitats. However, local residents understood that the real purpose was to ensure that the general public would not accidentally encounter whatever or whoever was living in the deep woods around Devil's Kettle. The final documented reference to the Thornfield crane case appears in a series of letters written between 1920 and 1925 by Father Michael Shannon, a Catholic priest who served the scattered rural communities of Crawford County. These letters, addressed to various church authorities and preserved in the diocesan archives, describe Father Shannon's attempts to minister to what he characterized as lost souls living beyond the reach of Christian civilization. Father Shannon had become aware of the situation through conversations with his parishioners, many of whom reported encounters with individuals who appeared to be living entirely outside the boundaries of normal human society. These reports consistently described people who seemed to possess supernatural abilities to survive in wilderness conditions, who avoided all contact with organized communities, and who appeared to be following some form of social organization that bore no resemblance to anything recognized by mainstream society. Acting on these reports, Father Shannon made multiple attempts to establish contact with the forest dwellers, hoping to offer them spiritual guidance and assistance in returning to civilized life. His letters describe a series of expeditions into the wilderness around Devil's Kettle, during which he left food, clothing, and religious materials in locations where he hoped they would be discovered by the people he sought to help. The priest's efforts yielded mixed results. The supplies he left were consistently taken, suggesting that his intended recipients were indeed finding and using them. However, his attempts at direct communication met with no success. Despite clear evidence that his presence in the forest was known and his offerings were being accepted, Father Shannon never succeeded in making face-to-face contact with any of the forest dwellers. More troubling were the responses that Father Shannon began to receive to his ministry efforts. On multiple occasions, he returned to locations where he had left supplies to find that religious symbols and biblical passages had been carved into nearby trees. These messages suggested that his intended audience was literate and familiar with Christian theology. But the content of their responses indicated a theological perspective that diverged significantly from Orthodox Church teaching. The carved messages frequently referenced themes of judgment, purification, and the need for separation between the righteous and the corrupt. Father Shannon's letters express his growing concern that the forest dwellers had developed a form of religious belief that justified their isolation from mainstream society and might be used to rationalize activities that the Church could never sanction. Father Shannon's most significant discovery came during his expedition in the summer of 1922, when he found what appeared to be a cemetery in a remote clearing deep within the protected forest area. The burial ground contained approximately 24 graves, marked with simple wooden crosses and arranged in rows that suggested careful planning and maintenance over many years. According to Father Shannon's description, the cemetery showed evidence of regular visitation, with fresh wildflowers and carefully arranged stones, indicating that someone was tending these graves with considerable devotion. The priest's examination of the burial markers revealed dates that spanned from the 1890s through the early 1920s, suggesting that the forest community had been maintaining this cemetery for decades. Most significant was Father Shannon's discovery that several of the graves bore dates that corresponded to the period immediately following the disappearance of Thornfield and Crane, raising the possibility that the missing trapper's final resting place had been located. Father Shannon's letters describe his decision to conduct religious services at the cemetery, believing that the souls buried there deserved proper Christian burial rites, regardless of the circumstances of their deaths. However, his attempt to perform these services was interrupted by what he described as clear signs that his activities were being observed and that his presence was not welcome. The priest reported hearing movements in the surrounding forest that suggested the presence of multiple people, along with sounds that he interpreted as attempts at communication or warning. When he continued with his planned service despite these interruptions, he found that his movements were being deliberately impeded by obstacles that appeared in his path and by equipment that mysteriously malfunctioned. Father Shannon's final letter regarding his ministry to the forest dwellers, written in December of 1925, describes his decision to discontinue his direct intervention efforts. The priest had concluded that the inhabitants of the deep woods had created a form of society that, while radically different from mainstream civilization, appeared to provide them with everything they needed for survival, and even a form of spiritual fulfillment. The letter notes that his years of observation had convinced him that the forest community was not simply a collection of individuals who had fled from civilization, but rather a functioning society with its own customs, beliefs, and social organization. He had observed evidence of cooperation, planning, and mutual support that suggested these people had successfully adapted to their environment and had created sustainable ways of life that did not depend on contact with the outside world. Father Shannon's recommendation to his church superiors was that the forest dwellers should be left alone to pursue their chosen way of life without further interference from outside authorities. He argued that their survival over many decades demonstrated that they had found solutions to the challenges of their existence, and that attempts to force them back into mainstream society would likely do more harm than good. The diocesan archives contain no record of any official response to Father Shannon's letters or any further church involvement in the matter of the forest dwellers. However, the archives do note that Father Shannon continued to include the wilderness community in his regular prayers, and maintained his practice of leaving occasional offerings at the edge of the protected forest area until his own death in 1934. The story of Ezekiel Thornfield and Matthias Crane and the larger mystery of the forest community they apparently encountered represents one of the most thoroughly documented cases of people choosing to live entirely outside the boundaries of mainstream society. The accumulated evidence from official investigations, personal accounts, and decades of indirect observation suggests a community that has successfully maintained its independence from the civilized world for well over a century. The documents preserved in various Missouri archives paint a picture of people who, when faced with the circumstances that ordinary society could never understand or accept, made the extraordinary decision to abandon the civilized world entirely and create something new in the depths of the American wilderness. Their story serves as a reminder that the boundary between civilization and wilderness has always been more permeable than we might prefer to believe, and that there have always been individuals willing to cross that boundary permanently when the alternative becomes unbearable. Whether Thornfield and Crane ultimately joined the forest community they discovered, met their deaths in attempting to protect its secrets, or found some other fate entirely, their story illustrates the complex relationship between individual choice and social obligation. The evidence suggests that both men concluded that their duty to protect the forest dwellers from outside interference outweighed their obligations to their families and their community, a decision that cost them everything they had previously valued, but that may have preserved something they had come to value even more. The Missouri wilderness that claimed two experienced trappers in 1893 continues to guard its secrets, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. In a world that grows smaller and more connected with each passing year, the possibility that there remain places where people can disappear completely, where communities can exist entirely outside the reach of government authority and social convention, offers a form of hope to those who understand that some forms of freedom can only be found in complete separation from everything that mainstream society considers normal and necessary. The campfire that was still warm when rescuers found the abandoned camp serves as a symbol of lives that were interrupted rather than ended, of choices made in circumstances that most people will never face, and of secrets that some individuals will sacrifice everything to protect. In the end, the fate of Thornfield and Crane reminds us that the price of certain kinds of knowledge may be the loss of everything we previously believed about ourselves and our place in the world, and that some discoveries are too profound to allow us to return unchanged to the lives we lived before we made them.